And welcome, Dr. Zaya. It's great to have you here. And it's my honor to introduce you. So let me say a few words about you to our audience. So Dr. Maria Cecilia Zaya is a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the George Washington University. She is the founding director of the George Washington University Latino Health Research Center and the co-director of the Social Behavioral Science Core of the District of Columbia Center for AIDS Research. She's also a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science. Her research and advocacy has centered on HIV prevention among Latino, gay, and bisexual men and transgender women in the US and in Colombia. She uses a community-based participatory approach in all phases of research, and she has one dealing with status among Latino MSM in DC, New York, and Boston. The second, on contextual factors of sexual risk among Brazilian, Colombian, and Dominican immigrant MSM. Third, on HIV prevalence, sexual risk, and attitudes towards circumcision among Colombian MSM. She's also the recipient of an R34 to develop a web novela to promote HIV testing among Colombian MSM. And she has been a co-investigator on other projects and studies, which include studying African-American, Latina women, immigrants, people with disabilities, and substance users. She has been a wonderful career mentor to lots of folks, directing over 22 dissertations, 19 master's theses, mentoring 26 graduate students, many who went on to receive all kinds of awards, and postdoc students as well. So, with an illustrious and distinguished career, I can add one more thing to that. She's also been a wonderful consultant to my own randomized controlled trial project, for which I'm very grateful. So with all of that, I am more than happy to introduce Dr. Maria Cecilia Zaya.
Thank you, Homero, for the great introduction and for the invitation to participate in the Grand Rounds. I hope that you will enjoy seeing some of my work. It's impossible to present all of it, but it is an honor to share some of it. So I'm going to share screen and start with some slides here. Let's see if you can see my slides. Okay. So I started doing research on HIV in 1997. And as Dr. Del Pino mentioned, I've had several NIH-funded awards. The first one, of course, is always dear to our hearts because that's the first one, of course, but also it was really connected to a topic close to my heart, which was disclosure of HIV status. I saw many men from the Latino community in the DC area, some friends of mine, die of AIDS without having disclosed their HIV status to anyone. And that propelled me to write a first grant, and the rest is history. And I will not give you all the details of what's in this slide, but somewhere after a couple of studies in the US, I started doing international research, and I went to Colombia, which is my country of origin. And I will tell you a little bit about some of those findings. But first, let's start with a note on the use of the word Latina, Latino, Latinx. Spanish is a really gendered language. Every object has a gender, the table, the chair, and we are, when we speak, and we're native speakers, as I am, we incorporate the gender automatically. We don't have to struggle to think about it. And that's a blessing, but it's also a curse in that we always, these people my age, my generation, we always tend to revert to the masculine, which has been for hundreds of years. However, I do endorse the use of the word Latinx, and as proposed by Ana Maria del Rio González in her paper to Latinx or not to Latinx, a question of gender inclusivity versus gender neutrality. And one of the issues is that transgender women and transgender men have struggled to claim a feminine or a masculine identity. And when we use the term Latinx, we're depriving them of that identity. Therefore, I don't use Latinx to include people like transgender men or women. And what she proposes is that we use it to refer to non-binary people, or when we are able to say Latinx instead of Latino, like you will see me revert back and forth throughout the presentation. I will talk about some of the challenges in conducting research on HIV among Latinas, Latinos, and Latinx in the US. The first challenge is to define who is Latina, who's not, identifying conceptual frameworks to include in social and behavioral research on Latinos, Latinas, and Latinx is an important challenge. And the last challenge is incorporating community-based participatory approaches in HIV prevention research. Just to contextualize this a little bit, Latino population in the US is 62.5 million. We're 19% of the US population. 19.8 million are foreign born. 81% are US citizens. And 27.6 million identify as having more than one race, versus 3 million in 2010. And this is one of the issues of identity, understanding that Latino is an ethnicity, it is not a race. Because who are we? Who are the Latinx? First of all, we are largely composed of descendants from the indigenous groups that migrated to the Americas more than 15,000 or 18,000 years ago. They were the original inhabitants, as we all know. Latin America was colonized by Spain and Portugal. Let me see, I need to close the little thing. Okay. This placed indigenous people in a position of lower social status. In addition, a large proportion of the US territory was Spanish. This is the US around 1783 and the US before the Mexican-American War. So many people of Latinos, Spanish ancestry really are indigenous to the United States also and have been here longer than many of the white Americans. But people tend not to remember this. There have been multiple diasporas coming to Latin America, and the largest one is the forced migration and enslavement of about 12 to 12.8 million Africans who were shipped across the Atlantic over a span of years. As you can see here, the majority were taken to Brazil, the British and the French Caribbean, followed by the Spanish Americans. Despite this diaspora, however, Black Latinos often disappear in health statistics and are often classified as African American. Black Latinos are often underrepresented in research, with some notable exceptions of studies that are focused on Black Latinos. But there are additional diasporas. Multiple diasporas arrived in Latin America, like the Japanese that are in Latin America, Italian, Greek, Basque, Chinese, and Jewish from Spain from the times of the expulsion to more recent times in which Jewish people have come from other parts of the world, Europe, Northern Africa, etc. There were also migrations from countries that were part of the Ottoman Empire, such as Syria and Lebanon. For instance, one example of a Lebanese Colombian is Shakira, who has Lebanese ancestry, but also Italian, Spanish, etc. Different Latino groups live in different regions in the US. For instance, a large proportion of Mexicans live in California, and many live also in Texas, whereas there is a smaller proportion of Mexicans in Washington, D.C., where the largest proportion is constituted by Salvadorans and other Latin American immigrants, for instance, people from South America, and people from Puerto Rico, etc. So this, I guess the different national origins determine to what extent, what type of population we collect when we collect data on Latinos, because if you come to the DC area, you will not be able to collect data on many Mexican Americans, but you will be able to collect data on other folks. Brazilians are an interesting case. Many Brazilians do not endorse Latino identity, and definitely do not endorse a Hispanic identity because they don't speak Spanish. They tend to distance themselves from Spanish-speaking Latinos, and they fall through the cracks in HIV research. However, they constitute an important and growing number of immigrants. Many of them have resettled in New York City. This is an example of one of the streets in New York City called Little Brazil. I think it's 52 Street or something like that. And many have settled in Massachusetts also. We actually have done research, and our research has contributed to exploring HIV among this group, Brazilian MSM. So to recapitulate, the Latino and Latin American population geographic ancestry is as diverse as the world, with almost every continent represented in its population. And we all have diverse admixtures of the different geographic ancestries. Again, Latino is an ethnic identity, not a racial category, but it is often racialized, and many scholarly papers do not reflect an understanding of diversity and diversities among Latinos. Let's move to the second part of our talk, which is the importance of identifying conceptual, social, and behavioral frameworks to include in HIV research on Latinas, Latinos, and Latinx. This is the socio-ecological framework adopted to HIV by Poundstone, Strathy, and Celentano, which includes structural, social, and individual factors, and their engagement and how they contribute to the HIV cascade, to HIV infection, the HIV cascade, and a number of outcomes. Historical forces, such as repressive regimes, revolutions, civil wars, violence, poverty, more recently climate change, and economic crisis, are structural factors, examples of structural factors that have largely contributed to the migration of nationals from many Latin American countries. Violence can range from intimate partner violence, violence perpetrated by states, military, and other armed forces. For instance, in Colombia, we have had decades of civil war, low-level civil war, in which guerrillas and paramilitaries have displaced millions of people from rural to urban areas. The US border has seen throngs of Latino immigrants, and they are again arriving to escape violence, poverty, and some of them come to join their families who have been in the US for a long time, but they have been separated, as is the case of many Latino children caught in the border. Migration can have positive or negative consequences. And the pre and post-migration social contexts are important determinants of health. In our own research with Latino MSM in New York City, we looked at the social context post-migration and the impact it had on their sexual experiences. So we conducted focus groups, each with different sets of Brazilian, Colombian, and Dominican MSM. And we conducted in-depth interviews with them to hear the voices directly. We talked to key informants, and we then conducted survey research using questions in Spanish, Portuguese, or English. One challenge is that this requires really multilingual, multicultural research teams. What we found when we did and we found, by the way, that in the qualitative part, that the social context that people encountered in their early years after migrating shaped their sexual behaviors. The anonymity of living in New York City, finding yourself in New York, which is a gay epicenter, was experienced as liberating and conducive to many sexual experiences of different kind. We also examined reasons for migration and its role in HIV acquisition using quantitative methods. And this is a paper by Karen Nieves Lugo and a bunch of us, in which we surveyed 482 Latino MSM, again, Brazilian, Colombian, and Dominican, who migrated to the New York City area. They migrated to the US for multiple reasons, such as to improve their financial situation. That was one of the most frequently endorsed reasons. To seek political asylum, to affirm their sexual orientation, and the reasons for migration differed by country of origin. Here are some of the frequencies where you can see which are the ones that are most commonly endorsed by whom. We also looked at the HIV status of these immigrants, and 26% were already living with HIV when we interviewed them. But we inquired about the time in which they seroconverted, and actually the majority tested positive after migration, 78.9% seroconverted while in the US. We examined in logistic regression models a couple of issues. One, whether migration to affirm sexual orientation, model A, or B, to avoid persecution, were associated with becoming HIV positive after arrival in the US. And we controlled for a bunch of variables like age, monthly income, education, etc. These analyses were done with those who migrated after the age of 15 and who were negative at the time of migration. So this is a subset of the sample, which consists of 276 participants. And we found that sexual migration to avoid persecution increased the odds of contracting HIV after arrival, but to live a gay life was not related to that. Here, we can appreciate in our sample the years in which migrations, I hope you can see the bottom, I don't know if you can see it, the years in which people started migrating to the US, but we start in the 60s and move all the way to the 70s, 80s, 90s. And the first migrants were Dominican, at the very bottom here in blue. And those immigrants started coming to the US during the dictatorship of Trujillo. Trujillo was dictator for many years and was assassinated in 1961. And after that, lots of things changed in the Dominican Republic, but most important, the original settlers became the inspiration for many Dominicans to come and move to the US. Brazilian migrations began during the Brazilian dictatorship, which was from 1964 to 1985. And it was a dictatorship that was not very friendly of gay people. And subsequent Brazilian migrations happened because of socioeconomic issues. And in Colombia, migration began particularly or increased in the 1980s when we had a lot of violence because of drug cartels and a lot of homophobia, negativity. And then some governments in which paramilitarism increased, and neither the guerrilla nor the paramilitary have been friendly towards LGBT people or towards people living with HIV. So that prompted a large migration to the United States. So back to Poundstone at all. There are also social level factors that have an impact on HIV outcomes. And one of those is transnationalism, which has been another force shaping the experiences of Latinos migrating, including HIV outcomes. Some of us migrate to the US, but also remain connected to our countries of origin and sometimes travel back and forth. So transnationalism is an old occurrence. People have been able to go back and forth unless they are undocumented, and then they can't migrate, and that becomes more problematic. I will quote Héctor Carrillo, who says that to address HIV/AIDS among Latinos, it is important to adopt a transnational perspective. It seems necessary to take into account the structural inequalities produced by the relationship between host and home countries and the conditions that led to the migration in the first place. It also seems necessary to consider the migrants' transnational connections with their home countries and whether psychosocial issues such as isolation and loneliness may be somewhat exacerbated by those connections. It's important to integrate transnationalism into research and interventions. And again, it's a way through which immigrants, through children, the way we maintain connections to the country of origins. And these practices have significant meaning and are important to be observed. Transnationalism also communities are connected and influence each other throughout different countries. And there's research that talks about how people, let's say, from one country exchange information with people from another country, particularly since the advent of social media, WhatsApp, and ways in which we can talk for free when in the past we couldn't do that. Additional frameworks could include intersectionality, is more recently used, in which a number of positions and social positions are mutually constituted and cannot be understood on their own because you can't detach one person's gender to study only their race and ethnicity. To quote Lisa Bolick, she says, once you blended the cake, you can't, the ingredients, you can't unblend the cake. And some of this happens with intersectionality. And several of my students have been doing a lot of work on intersectionality, and several of my colleagues. I will pause briefly to see if there are, no, before that, okay, I have to remind you, okay, so what is the take-home message thus far? Well, we need a better understanding of what it is to be Latino, including those that are indigenous to the US, Black Latinos, Asian Latinos, understand racial diversity and take it into account. In addition, be aware that there's a constant influx of immigrants that kind of regenerates the pool and brings, again, like, I guess, keeps the Spanish language alive. And we need to continue to integrate frameworks, different frameworks that could help us understand and develop research programs that are meaningful. Why is this important? Well, health disparities are connected to Latinx diverse racial groups, but their impact is unaccounted in most recent research and national statistics. Also, because the health outcomes differ greatly depending on whether we're talking about US-born versus immigrant versus undocumented Latinos. And last but not least, the current anti-immigrant sentiment and racism against Latinos contributes to make invisible these populations and prevent them from accessing services and therefore increasing HIV risk among this group. So I'll pause here in case there are any questions, comments thus far. If none, I can move on.
Oh, sorry, I'm just gonna let people know you can also put your questions in the chat if you don't want to face the audience. You can also put your questions in the chat. I'll be happy to read them out, Zaya.
Thank you. Okay, so now we move to incorporating community-based participatory research. So for this, I'll talk about my research program on Colombian MSM. The first one, which was a 5-year program funded by the NICHD, and the second one, a web novella to promote HIV testing with many collaborations, many people. And the first R1 was on HIV prevalence, sexual risk, and attitudes towards circumcision. Colombia has also a very large population right now, 51 million people, and a fairly high HIV prevalence, particularly among MSM. The prevalence ranges from 10% to 20%, depending on the year, depending on the recruitment methods. And for the most part, these numbers have been obtained in larger cities. Again, we use our famous Poundstone et al. Conceptual framework to understand and disentangle what factors can contribute to HIV prevalence in Colombia. So one of our goals was taking into account all those structural, social, and individual factors, study the HIV prevalence among MSM in Bogota. We had both methodology and quantitative we used mixed methods research with a phase that was predominantly qualitative, which allowed us to hear the voices of participants, of key informants, etc. We wanted to understand also a particular group, which is MSM who were internally displaced by the conflict in Colombia. So we were able to interview 32. We were able to also interview 10 transgender women who had been internally displaced. And we did 9 focus groups with 78 participants to obtain other types of information, such as societal and cultural forces and all these issues which I have kind of mentioned in the, as I talked about the Poundstone socio-ecological model. Okay, so for the qualitative research, we used in vivo for textual analysis, inductive data microcoding. Our research team consisted of 5 Latino researchers. 2 were in Colombia and 3 were in the US. We used at least 2 coders for each interview and 1 reviewer for all coding so that we could achieve some consistency. And discrepancies were discussed and resolved by the full team using Skype. These are some samples of the papers that we published based on the qualitative data, where we looked at armed conflict, homonegativity, and forced internal displacement, mixed methods research, and the last one is on sex work among Latino MSM and transgender women. Because of time constraints, I will not talk about the quantitative research, but we'll focus more on the quantitative research component. We always do pilot testing and revise any quantitative survey we administer. We also did HIV counseling and testing using rapid oral HIV testing, and the new cases of people who did not know they were living with HIV received estimated, were examined using Architect AG-AB combo from Abbott. And those samples, 69, of those 69 samples, 7 were from transgender women. We always use Akasi, laptop language, computers with touchscreen component, bilingual. Well, in this case, everything was in Spanish because the research was in Colombia. Participants were MSM ages 15 to 49. We used respondent-driven sampling. Participants could recruit up to 3 people. We first pilot tested the RDS sampling with 100 and then 1,000 were the full administration. We only needed 4 seeds to recruit these 1,000 MSM, which is amazing because I know some people have trouble recruiting with RDS and have to resort to increasing the number of seeds. Seed number 4 was super productive. There's another seed which was not so productive, but nevertheless we were able to achieve our sample of 1,000 MSM. And given the large population in Bogota, which at the time was like 5 million people, now we're 8 million people, or 10 million people, I can't remember. It wasn't complicated to obtain this large sample size. The blue squares, let me see if I can hide this bar somewhere. The blue squares are people who knew their HIV status, and the red squares are people who did not know their HIV status and found that they were living with HIV after participating in a study, after receiving the HIV test. What it's interesting here is that you observe the social networks. Like there is an entire branch in which that social network, everyone is negative, but there are other social networks in which it's more common that there are people living with HIV, or that there are people who find out that they're living with HIV. And in the end, you are more likely to become infected if your social network is infected. And this is a great example of how this can occur. Quick, I'm going to run through these slides. Fairly high educational level of these participants. They tended to be youngish, but very low weekly income. Maybe some because they were still studying, but also Colombia is a country with huge inequalities, and a large percentage were making below the average wage. sexual orientation, majority identified as gay or homosexual, followed by bisexual, and a select few heterosexual, a total of 12 heterosexual or straight. These could be actually, and I should have looked at that, transgender women who identify as straight if their sex partner is a male. Gender identity, 94.2%, and transgender women were 58 in the quantitative part, or 5.8%. Now, here we go to some of the most interesting findings, and it's that only 54% had tested for HIV prior to participating in this study. This is extremely low, and this is a public health problem. And moreover, of those who had tested, the 536, the majority had tested less than, more than a year ago, or had not tested in the previous year, 60%. So this, and here are the HIV results of the people who knew that that they were living with HIV, those who did not know they were living with HIV. This is what, of those who had never tested, no, wait a minute. Here, yes, this is, the majority, of course, were negative, 9.9% were positive. Some never went to pick up their results. I think this is an important issue. And some did not remember or did not respond or did not get the results. So that's an interesting feature. Of those who were living with HIV, a majority were receiving antiretroviral treatment, which means that if you know you're living with HIV in Colombia, you're likely to be engaged in antiretroviral treatment. Now, here are the results of the OraQuick test, and this is why I was confused with the other slide. This is of the people that we tested, 1,124, or 12.4% tested positive. Of those who tested positive, 53 were aware, 71 were unaware that they were living with HIV. And after adjusting for respondent-driven sampling, the adjusted prevalence is 12.1%. So very low rates of ever testing. One of the things that we found was that lack of health insurance or insufficient health insurance was strongly related to low HIV testing. Again, high prevalence of being unaware. The avidity index, and when we examined the 69 serum samples, is that 61 were old HIV infections, 2 were new, and 6 were in the gray zone. It is a serious public health problem when people are living with HIV for extended periods of time and they don't know. So one of the suggestions we make is that we need to develop interventions to promote HIV testing. So here's where our community-based participatory research component appears. And one of the questions that I hope we can address at the end is whether this responds to some of the challenges of doing HIV research. So this is, for this purpose, we did a web novella to promote HIV testing, or we aimed to develop a web novella to promote HIV testing. Again, the background is that we saw that there were low levels of testing, high prevalence of HIV and low awareness of seropositive status, and that many were undetected, untreated old infections. So we, in addition to develop with the web novella, we also were to examine the feasibility and acceptability of the web novella intervention to increase HIV testing. So we used community-based participatory approach to develop Bondage, the risk is not to know, was the title. It's a web-based film. It ended up being a film, and I'll tell you later that it's because that's what the community participatory research suggested, that the product looked more like a film than like chapters, and therefore the web novella became the web film. Throughout the process, community members participated, and the title was suggested by them, which is interesting. You know, I probably would have not chosen to highlight bondage so much, but it really appealed to our community. So that's where we went. Okay, so CBPR team composition. Many young MSM from Bogota, members of community organizations, experts in entertainment education and media production, and researchers and research staff. This is the CBPR team. And we used 5 steps to develop the product. The first one was develop a message that is evidence-based, then convey it to the communication and the media development professionals. It's called the message brief. And it has to be very brief, by the way. Then develop the story, write the script, and finally produce and edit the video. So these are the 5 steps. Part of the feedback we received from the community and professionals was obtained through 11 focus groups with young MSM who were not part of the CBPR team. And we also interviewed key informants working in relevant areas like infectious disease physicians, HIV prevention specialists from the Department of Health, etc., to make sure that the evidence-based approach was consistently used. So here are some of the, like we had creative workshops, many meetings, discussions. This is a subset, a minuscule subset of the very ambitious and extensive timeline. Here we have only like May and June, and you see all the different color codes of the different activities that need to be executed in order to produce this monumental task. And what this shows really is that I didn't know what I was getting into. The other part is part of the validation process. This is an example of how we took notes of what happened in the focus groups. And then after the focus groups discussions and agreeing on the message, we drafted characters and script. So this is a photo of the little sticky notes that we used for that purpose. Then we did casting and validation of casting, and we run all of this by the focus groups that are participating in providing us feedback. And lessons learned in the process of developing this web novella. The first thing is that I really underestimated the potential conflict that could arise among researchers, the educational entertainment professionals, the script writers, the producers, and the director. This was interesting, and now I can smile about it, but at the time it wasn't fun to be witnessing some of this. The other challenge is that the investigators can lose control of the production process and the final product. We, according to this methodology in which we, in the end, let the professionals take over, I mean, I could sit and watch some of the filming, but I did not have a say. Only people who were labeled guardians of the message were the people who were able to like provide feedback to the director and the actors and say, wait, this is not what we're trying to say. Direction and editing also impact the final product. And we underestimated the amount of time it takes to post-produce videographic material. This is pictures of the group viewing that we had with the community, the LGBT community in Bogota. The final product was appealing to them and to members of the target group. So then we set to examine so now we know it's feasible to develop a web novella. And now we needed to find out how acceptable it was to increase HIV testing. And
Sorry,
although,
excuse me,
yeah.
Dr. So we have about 10 minutes. I just wanted to make sure you
Oh,
were
yeah,
that, so we leave some time for questions from the audience.
absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, but I'll wrap it up fast. So, although not a name of the grant application, we obtained some preliminary evidence. So, challenge here, more challenges. The baseline survey participants, easy to recruit 300 MSM. This is our original randomization, acceptability surveys, and final randomization. People who viewed the web novella were invited to respond to a survey 6 months after viewing it. The control group did not receive that intervention. People thought it was informative, like the video, that they thought friends would like it. They were moderately engaged. Only 5 participants would not recommend to their friends. And challenges was a slow uptake by individual viewers. They distrusted our emails, or they don't open their emails, not sure what happens. They distrust clicking on links to watch the video. The web novella was too long, and we didn't give incentives to watch. So would there have been more uptake in group viewings? It's possible. And we had some preliminary findings of efficacy. Most important, that knowledge about HIV-related rights increased only for the intervention group. But one challenge was that there was a ceiling effect, which is that at the time we ran this study, 74% of the MSM had been tested versus when we first collected data, which was 54%. And most of them had high intentions to get tested at baseline, which means, again, that we can't test an effect. So we recommend this intervention in other cities. This intervention is scalable. It could be used with flexibility to promote HIV testing in other cities. And this is a paper in which we published some of those findings, acknowledging my colleagues, my research team, and this is more age progression slide. Okay, and now I'm going to try to stop sharing so that we can move to questions and answers.
Hey,
If you're still awake.
Thank you for your talk. The floor is now open for questions. Well, if there are no questions for now, I'm happy to engage in a conversation, Dr. Zaya. I do have some questions. The first question, which may be of interest to our audience, is like, what is a common pitfall that early stage investigators fall into when starting research with our communities?
Well, one is that everything takes longer than it takes. And that's not my original quote. I'm quoting somebody I met in graduate school, and I have never forgotten that. Second, sometimes we get involved in very ambitious projects. And for instance, my R01 required a lot of work, but no other grant has required as much work as the R34 because it was an intervention. So intervention research takes time and it doesn't always work. So that's a pitfall. You want to show that you have findings and you want to be able to publish your work. So I recommend collecting lots of formative data on which you can publish papers and you can write papers. So I think there's some more questions here. The importance of understanding the population's ethnicity further. Well, so for instance, why is it important to understand? So in my Colombian study, we also asked about geographic ancestry, whether people were indigenous, African, Spanish, etc., or proportions and or permutations. And when we look at experiences of violence, we found that those who were darker were more likely to have experienced violence throughout the country. So that's one example of really disentangling and understanding how social positions can occur even within a country. And that has an impact also on access to health, HIV treatment, etc. So I'd say that's one of the reasons why I think it is important to understand.
Dr. Zaya, I did have another question, and I wanted to revisit a topic with you. Wondering if you can share, if you have any thoughts on how funding structures like NIH might create these sort of divisions in communities. So there are health differences between US-born Latinos and Latinos who immigrate. But at the same time, like when I've done research, let's say on PrEP, we get everyone, right? Like not everyone thinks that you're born here, you're born over there. So we're not, we don't talk to each other. It's more of a fluid community. And sometimes within families, you have people born here and people born somewhere else. So, but it seems like funders want us to pick. You're only working with immigrants. You're only working with Spanish speakers. You're only working with U.S. born, and it feels like some kind of like artificial like conventions are being imposed on communities. How this affects our research.
Yeah, it is a challenge. Like you're in Los Angeles, so you will find a very different population from the populations I found here in New York City or in DC. So only in my disclosure study is when I have Mexicans, I say Mexican American, not even immigrants, because as I said earlier, Mexicans are indigenous to the United States also. So some of it is driven by the type of sample you're able to collect. To this day, there's no HPTN study including only Latinos, which would be one way of ensuring we can recruit people from all over the US that will include more indigenous versus more African descent and any permutation with Europeans, European Latinos, etc. So and so this is one of the factors that may dictate what we do. Some people really want to focus on immigrants, and my second R01 was only immigrants. My first R01 was US born and immigrants. It was easier to collect immigrants, partly because I was well embedded in the immigrant Latino community. I am an immigrant myself. I knew many people working in organizations who helped me find immigrants, but that's not the largest majority. And sometimes Latinos disappear after a couple of generations if they are not a visible minority. So then they're harder to locate. And regarding NIH, one challenge, actually, we've had certain challenges, like when I was doing the second study, Congress started researching and investigating, trying to stop funding of grants that had to do with gay people. I remember grants by dear colleagues being attacked. Luckily, the NIH prevailed and didn't allow these Congress people to shut down those studies, but there are different threats at different times that could affect our research. when people become highly anti-immigrant, for instance, maybe it's dangerous to include immigrants in our research or to advertise that they are immigrants. So there are a number of challenges that are not easy to overcome when we do this type of research.
Okay. Oh, we got a question. Final question. Is there a way for the rest of us to watch the web novela where we can find it?
Yeah, I can send the link upon request. I forgot to include my email address. I'll type it in the chat. And I was actually trying to see if I could play the trailers. We have trailers. So I could paste the trailer, and if you don't lose your place in the queue, you can possibly play it. Let's see if this...
Sorry. And while you do that, I want to squeeze in one more question that I missed in the chat regarding the web novela. Do you have any plans to develop similar programs for like Dominicans and or Brazilian MSM?
No, I want younger people to develop those programs. It really takes so much time and energy. It requires all the energy. Okay, let me paste here the link. It requires all the energy of the world. So I'll help anyone. I'll carry your books. I'll be supportive. And I would love to see you guys, particularly early career researchers, embracing this type of work. So,
all right. Well, we have reached our time. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Zea, for sharing your knowledge with us and your insights over your long research career, and for encouraging us to go out and do web novelas. Again, thank you for your time. And there was a link, a survey put in the chat for everyone else in the audience to evaluate the presentation today. So please click on that before you sign off.
And thank you everyone for your attention. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Zea.
Thank you.